Welcome to Reform Thinking. You know, when you go to a doctor with a physical injury, there is usually a very clear, objective way to figure out what went wrong.
Right.
If you fall and hurt your arm, well, the doctor takes an X-ray. The image comes up on the screen, and you see a jagged white line across the bone.
Yeah, it is undeniable.
So the doctor points at it and gives you a definitive diagnosis. It is broken. The path forward is obvious. You set the bone, put it in a cast, and wait for it to heal.
We love that kind of clarity, honestly. We crave situations where the problem is visible, neatly categorized, and just easy to understand.
Yeah, exactly.
When the problem is isolated to a single bone, the solution is straightforward.
But then you step out of the hospital and look at the world of geopolitical devastation. You look at a massive societal collapse, and suddenly that metaphorical X-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, yeah. It does not work at all.
You cannot just take a snapshot of a ruined nation, point to one specific jagged line and say, there is the problem. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky and, well, chaotic.
That is a very accurate way to frame it.
You are looking at a society that has been shattered by an unprovoked invasion. So the central question for you, the listener, as we tackle this material today is this: how do you rebuild a shattered society?
It is such a massive question.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we have a huge stack of sources on the table today regarding the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia war. We are focusing specifically on data coming out of early 2026.
And as you read through this material, a major core tension jumps right off the page.
Yeah, it really does.
It is a fierce, ongoing debate between two opposing forces. On one side, you have the absolute demand to hold perpetrators accountable. You have the demand to execute strict, unyielding justice.
Right.
On the other side, you have the urgent, practical need to move on, to rebuild the physical infrastructure, and to establish some kind of social cohesion so people can actually live together again.
The secular political science view often claims these two forces directly oppose one another.
Yeah, they do.
They argue that you cannot have a unified, functioning society if you're constantly dragging thousands of people into courtrooms for years on end.
Which, makes sense from a purely logistical standpoint.
But they also recognize that you cannot have true justice if you just pave over the mass graves, rebuild the highways, and pretend nothing happened.
That tension is the central dilemma we are unpacking today in this deep dive.
Yes, it is.
And to analyze this tension, we are looking through two distinct lenses drawn from two very different texts. The first text is an international relations essay focused on the political science of transitional justice.
Okay, so a very secular structural view.
Right. It focuses on the practical reconstruction in Ukraine, looking at the legal and social mechanisms of rebuilding.
And the second text.
The second text is a rigorous theological essay analyzing civil governance. It looks at this exact same tension through the specific lens of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, focusing entirely on chapter 13, verses 1 through 7.
That is a massive contrast in methodology.
It really is. But what makes this deep dive so fascinating to me is that both of these sources arrive at the exact same conclusion.
Really, they agree.
They do. They both conclude that justice and rebuilding must be fully integrated. You cannot have one without the other.
That is wild.
However, they arrive at that conclusion through completely different lines of reasoning.
Right, I would expect that.
The political science text argues for integration based on institutional trust, civic stability, and practical sociology. The theological text argues for integration based on the sovereign decree of God and the moral necessity of retributive wrath against evil.
So, before we look at the solutions presented in these texts, we have to establish the staggering reality on the ground.
Yeah, we cannot skip that.
We have to understand why this is not just an academic debate. The political science text makes it clear why the demand for justice is so incredibly loud right now.
The human cost is just, it is horrific.
It is. The February 24, 2022 invasion led to massive, catastrophic fallout across the entire region. Let us break down the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees data from February 2026.
The numbers are almost too large to comprehend, honestly.
They are. We need to pause and think about what they actually represent. The data shows 3.7 million internally displaced persons.
Wow. 3.7 million.
That is 3.7 million people who had to pack whatever they could carry and flee their homes, but who remained inside the borders of the country.
Right, so they are sleeping in gymnasiums, living with distant relatives, or, crammed into temporary housing.
Exactly. Then we are looking at 5.9 million refugees recorded globally.
That is just an astronomical figure.
These are people who crossed international borders, scattering across Europe and beyond. They are trying to find safety and figure out how to enroll their kids in foreign schools while dealing with massive trauma.
And when you add those numbers up, you also have 10.8 million people needing immediate humanitarian assistance just to survive.
It is a total rupture of normal life.
It is. To add to that grim picture, we have to look at the violent reality that continued well into the conflict.
Right. The fighting did not just stop.
Not at all. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission data from May 2026 recorded at least 274 civilian deaths and 1,763 civilian injuries in that single month alone.
Wait, in just 1 month?
Just 1 month. The text points out that this marked the highest monthly civilian casualty rate since April 2022.
So 4 years into the conflict, the violence was actually spiking to levels not seen since the very beginning of the invasion.
Yeah, precisely. And these are not just statistics on a spreadsheet. They represent a massive rupture in the social fabric.
Absolutely.
A society is essentially a web of relationships, trusts, and daily routines. When you have violence on this scale, that web is totally obliterated.
The author of the International Relations essay points out that numbers of this magnitude do not just describe physical damage or demographic shifts.
Right, they do something else entirely.
They generate very specific, very loud claims.
Claims? What kind of claims?
Well, when you have millions of people displaced and thousands of casualties, you have a population demanding answers from the universe, and more specifically, from their government.
Oh,
Families are demanding the names of the guilty. They are demanding the return of bodies so they can have a proper burial. They want their stolen property restored.
They want public recognition of their suffering.
Yes, and they want the strict legal punishment of the perpetrators. The text argues that a political strategy asking victims to stay silent for the sake of national unity will only manufacture intense bitterness.
Yeah, that makes sense. You cannot just tell people to move on.
You really cannot. You
Yeah.
cannot walk up to a mother whose child was deported or a father whose home was reduced to rubble and tell them to forget about it so the country can move forward and build a new train station.
No, that would be incredibly callous.
The demand for accountability is a massive, immovable reality. It is a weight that sits on the chest of the entire nation.
That is a very accurate summary of the secular dilemma, but the political science text also warns about the danger of letting those claims completely dominate the rebuilding phase.
What happens if they do dominate?
Well, if the entire machinery of the state is focused solely on looking backward and prosecuting every single grievance, the future collapses. The society cannot actually resume functioning.
Right. If we go back to our medical analogy, we can see how precarious this is.
Oh, yeah, the X-ray analogy.
Imagine a trauma surgeon working on a patient who has just been pulled from a horrific car crash. The patient has a shattered femur, a severely broken bone. That broken bone represents the absolute need for justice. It is real, it is painful, and it has to be fixed. But the patient is also bleeding out from a severed artery.
And that severed artery represents what?
It represents the immediate need for infrastructure, water, electricity, and social cohesion.
Right, the stuff that keeps the body alive right now.
Exactly. If the surgeon focuses entirely on setting the broken bone, prosecuting the perpetrators, holding tribunals, tracking down the guilty, but ignores the bleeding artery, the patient dies on the operating table.
Wow. So the country collapses from a lack of basic resources and a lack of societal trust.
Yes, but conversely, if the surgeon just stitches up the skin over a shattered, misaligned bone and pumps the patient full of blood, the bone heals crooked.
The patient survives, but they are permanently crippled.
The society survives, but it's crippled permanently by untreated grievances, festering anger, and a lack of moral resolution.
That surgical analogy captures the precise risk outlined in the political science text. The author warns against turning the post-war environment into a theater of vengeance.
A theater of vengeance. That is a heavy phrase.
It is. When a country is liberated, there is a natural, visceral desire to purge the community of anyone who might have collaborated with the enemy.
Sure, people are angry.
But if every single public process becomes a hunt for collaborators, and if every liberated community is treated with intense suspicion by the central government, the state cannot physically or socially rebuild.
It just tears itself apart from the inside.
Exactly. The text asks us to consider the incredible diversity of groups that must somehow figure out how to live next door to each other again after the dust settles.
Who are we talking about here?
It lists them out, and the friction is obvious. You have combat veterans who spent years suffering in the trenches.
Right.
And they have to live alongside conscientious objectors who refuse to fight.
Oh, wow. That is a tough dynamic.
Then you have Western residents who were displaced from their homes, and Eastern residents who endured the psychological horrors of a brutal occupation.
Totally different experiences of the same war.
You also have Crimean Tatars who have their own distinct historical trauma, and you have Russian-speaking patriots who fought bravely for Ukraine, but whose primary language is now heavily politicized and viewed with suspicion by some.
So, if the state uses a blunt instrument to determine loyalty, turning neighbor against neighbor in a quest for absolute purity, the country splinters into 1,000 fractured factions.
That is the exact fear the secular author outlines.
Okay, so we have established the secular dilemma. The demand for justice is absolute, but the need for social cohesion is equally absolute.
Right.
How does a biblical framework handle this exact tension between punishing wrongdoers and pursuing peace? This is where we bring in the theological essay based on Romans 13.
This is such a fascinating pivot.
The secular world often sees a direct contradiction between dropping the hammer of justice and extending the hand of rebuilding. They think you have to choose one or the other, or at least constantly compromise between the two.
Yeah, it is seen as a zero-sum game.
But the theological author rejects this false dilemma completely. The author grounds their argument in a historical theological document, the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Specifically looking at chapter 23, which deals with the civil magistrate.
Yes. The text argues that the civil magistrate is armed with the sword, specifically to defend the good and punish evildoers.
So it is not an either-or scenario where justice competes with peace.
According to this framework, true peace is the direct result of lawful justice being executed.
That is a bold claim. The theological essay provides a rigorous breakdown of the original Greek text in Romans 13, specifically verses 1 and 2, to prove this point.
I love when we get to unpack the original language.
The author looks at the command, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities." The Greek word used for subject there is hupotastheto.
Hupotaxitho. Okay, what does that carry in the original context?
Well, the author points out this is a continuous mandatory military term. It means to arrange oneself under a commanding officer.
So it is structural, not just emotional.
Right. It is totally distinct from sheer blind obedience to a dictator. You arrange yourself under the structure of authority because of what the text calls the diatage.
And diatage translates to what?
It translates to the divine ordinance. God is the primary agent who establishes these seats of authority.
Wow, okay.
The essay stresses a very specific point here. The believer submits to the civil government not because the politicians occupying those seats are morally pure or because they agree with every policy.
Right, because we know politicians are often corrupt.
Exactly. They submit because the structure of governance itself is a decree from the sovereign ruler of the universe. Therefore, resisting legitimate civil authority and its lawful functions is not just a political crime.
What is it then?
It is resisting God's sovereign decree.
I have to bring up a major modern objection to this kind of strict retributive framework, though.
Sure, go ahead.
In modern sociology and criminology, we see a massive push toward humanistic theories of restorative justice.
Oh, yes. That is very popular right now.
This view treats the state almost like a therapeutic institution. It argues that the goal of the justice system is not to punish, but to heal the offender and reintegrate them into society.
Which sounds very nice on paper.
Right. But think about taking a criminal trial for a horrific atrocity, like an intentional strike on a civilian shelter, and trying to turn it into a group therapy session.
That is a jarring image.
The goal of restorative justice in that setting is just to make everyone talk about their feelings, understand the root causes of the behavior, and make the offender feel included again.
Yeah, that does not fit the reality of warfare.
The problem is, if the state is just a giant therapy circle, then the sword the magistrate carries is made of foam. It has no edge. How does the theological text respond to that modern impulse?
The theological essay directly refutes that therapeutic view by focusing intensely on verses 3 and 4 of Romans 13.
What do those verses highlight?
The text argues that the magistrate is explicitly identified as theodiakonos, which translates to God's envoy or God's servant.
Okay, so a servant of God.
But the text is very careful to note that this is a judicial, punitive service, It is not a pastoral service.
That is a key distinction.
The symbol of the magistrate's office in this passage is the machera. The author points out that this is not a lictor's rod.
What is a lictor's rod?
A lictor's rod was used by Roman officials for a light beating or to maintain crowd control. It was basically a wooden stick.
Got it. So Paul did not use the word for a stick.
No, he used machera. That was the short Roman sword used specifically for capital punishment.
Oh, wow. That is intense.
It is. It represents the aegis gladii, the right of the sword, which is the state's authority to execute lethal force against evildoers.
So it is very clearly about strict punishment, not therapy.
Yes. The text further identifies the magistrate as an ekdikos, an avenger executing retributive wrath on the wrongdoer.
An avenger executing wrath.
The state is not a therapist. The state is the instrument of God's temporal wrath against evil. The magistrate's job is to vindicate the moral law by punishing the lawbreaker.
So under this theological argument, when the state fails to punish evil, what happens?
When it fails to punish evil, it is actually derelict in its duty to God.
Okay, so we have established that both the secular international relations source and the theological source agree that the sword of justice must be wielded.
Yes, they are unified on that front.
The secular text wants it wielded to create social stability and deter future crimes. The theological text wants it wielded because God demands the punishment of evil.
Two different paths to the same action.
But moving from theory to practice, how does Ukraine actually execute this without it turning into a bloodbath of uncontrolled revenge?
That is the practical nightmare they face.
The international relations text details specific international mechanisms currently at work to handle the highest level of crimes.
Right, the massive geopolitical stuff.
Yes, we have the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which has issued warrants for senior Russian figures.
The big names.
The text specifically names Vladimir Putin, Maria Lvova-Belova, Sergei Kobylash, Viktor Sokolov, Sergei Shoigu, and Valery Gerasimov. These are the architects of the conflict.
Right.
Furthermore, the Council of Europe established a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. This tribunal was created specifically to handle the leadership crimes, the initial decision to invade, that the ICC cannot legally prosecute due to jurisdictional limits.
And the theological essay forcefully supports these international mechanisms.
It does.
Yes. The author notes that with over 200,000 documented atrocities, failing to prosecute these crimes is a direct insult to divine holiness.
200,000 documented atrocities. That number is just staggering.
The sheer scale of the evil requires a proportional, formal response. The essay argues that true peace requires vindicated righteousness. You cannot just shake hands and walk away from 200,000 atrocities.
No, you absolutely cannot.
However, the international relations text outlines the severe practical risks associated with domestic trials.
Because the international courts cannot handle 200,000 cases, right?
Right. Exactly. While you absolutely need domestic courts to handle the massive volume of cases that international courts will never have the time to touch, there is a terrible danger of overreach at the local level.
Overreach by the local prosecutors.
Yes. The author cites a December 2025 report from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR.
What did that report find?
This report warned that Ukrainian authorities were sometimes prosecuting citizens for what the author calls coerced survival under occupation.
Coerced survival. That concept is fascinating and heartbreaking.
It really is.
Let us think about what that actually looks like on the ground. Imagine a town is suddenly occupied by a hostile military force. The central government is gone, the military is gone, the local citizens are trapped.
A total nightmare scenario.
Let us say there's a local utility worker, a guy who manages the municipal water plant.
Okay.
If he refuses to go to work in protest of the occupation, the entire town, his friends, his family, his neighbors, will lose access to clean drinking water, and they might die of thirst or disease.
So he has to go to work.
He goes to work. He keeps the water running. But in doing so, he is technically operating under the authority of the occupying administration. He might have to sign a piece of paper with an enemy stamp on it just to get the chemicals to treat the water.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going.
When the town is eventually liberated, prosecuting that man as a traitorous collaborator destroys social cohesion. He was not trying to aid the enemy. He was trying to keep his neighbors alive.
Right. He was just surviving.
Distinguishing between actual malicious treason and just trying to survive a nightmare scenario seems incredibly difficult for a local judge.
It is an agonizing legal line to walk. To manage this incredibly fraught situation, the political science text proposes a strict hierarchy of prosecution.
A hierarchy. How does that work?
It outlines 4 distinct tiers to help the domestic courts prioritize and avoid punishing survival behaviors.
Okay, what is Tier 1?
Tier 1 focuses entirely on atrocity crimes. This is the highest priority. It includes intentional attacks on civilian targets, systematic torture, and forced deportations.
The worst of the worst.
The people who committed or ordered these acts face the full weight of the justice system. Tier 2 is aggression leadership. These are the geopolitical cases meant for the special tribunal in The Hague.
Okay, so the local courts handle Tier 1, The Hague handles Tier 2. What is Tier 3?
Tier 3 involves voluntary and substantial collaboration. This involves citizens who actively and willingly aided the occupation.
So people who chose to help.
These are people who voluntarily produced propaganda, took over local administration, or actively seized the assets of their neighbors who had fled. They chose to profit from the suffering of their community.
And then we get to the bottom of the list. Tier 4 is the absolute lowest priority.
Right.
The text defines this as minor administrative cooperation under duress. This is our water plant operator. This is the local baker who sold bread to occupying soldiers because they held a gun to his head.
Exactly.
The political science text argues that wasting judicial resources on Tier 4 prosecutions completely destroys the legitimacy of the courts.
Because it looks so unfair.
If you are throwing the baker in jail while the generals who ordered the bombings walk free, the public loses all faith in the system.
They absolutely do.
But this creates a massive practical problem for the individual citizen. Imagine you are a resident who stayed in the town. You watched your neighbor willingly collaborate with the enemy. You saw them point out homes to be looted.
That would boil your blood.
But the courts are moving incredibly slowly because they are overwhelmed and prioritizing Tier 1 cases. Your neighbor is walking around the town square, free, while you are grieving.
That is a terrible situation to be in.
How does the individual citizen restrain their own anger in that gap between the crime and the trial?
Well, the theological text addresses that precise emotional and spiritual crisis by looking at the literary context of Romans 13.
The context around the verses.
Yes. The author points out a vital structural element in Paul's letter. Right before Paul discusses the magistrate's sword in chapter 13, he writes Romans chapter 12. And Romans 12 contains a strict, absolute prohibition against personal vengeance. The individual believer is commanded to leave vengeance to the wrath of God.
So you cannot take matters into your own hands.
Right. The essay argues that the citizen lays down the fist precisely because the state takes up the sword. The individual does not take the law into their own hands. They do not form a mob. They do not burn down the collaborator's house.
Why not?
Because God has ordained the civil magistrate to execute that justice objectively without the blinding heat of personal passion.
That is very high calling for the state.
It is. This theological boundary prevents the society from devolving into vigilante mob rule. The state absorbs the demand for retribution, acting as a lightning rod, which allows the citizen to step back and live peaceably.
Moving beyond the courtroom, the sources highlight another massive issue in the rebuilding process. Trials, by their very nature, individualize guilt.
Yes, they pinpoint a specific person.
They pinpoint a specific defendant, they list specific dates, and they focus on a specific definable crime. But a criminal trial cannot capture the macro-level destruction of a whole society. A prosecutor cannot indict an enemy state for the loss of a city's cultural identity or the psychological trauma of a generation.
No, the legal system is not built for that.
This realization transitions us to the need for a shared vocabulary of suffering. The sources call the mechanism for this a truth commission.
A truth commission.
The international relations text relies on the definition provided by the International Center for Transitional Justice.
The ICTJ.
Yes. The ICTJ defines a truth commission as a victim-centered response to massive human rights violations that combines several elements: accountability, acknowledgement, redress, reform, and prevention.
That is a very comprehensive approach.
We can see the staggering scale of this need through the Register of Damage for Ukraine. The text notes that this register had already received over 45,000 claims by April 2026.
45,000 claims. That is a mountain of paperwork. The text details the specific macro harms that a criminal court simply cannot easily prosecute, yet require massive public acknowledgement. Like, a trial focuses on murder or theft, but what about the systemic, coerced passportization of citizens in occupied territories?
Passportization. That is when occupying forces force residents to accept foreign citizenship.
Right, yes, just to access basic medical care or keep their homes.
Wow.
And what about stolen school curricula? Imagine being a child in an occupied town, and suddenly your teachers are replaced, your textbooks are burned, and you are forced to learn a fabricated history that claims your nation does not even exist.
That is cultural erasure.
It is. You cannot easily put a single person on trial for the erasure of a national identity, but that harm is real and devastating.
Absolutely.
The text also mentions the systematic destruction of energy systems meant to freeze populations during the winter and the catastrophic ecological damage to forests and rivers.
So how does the Truth Commission handle this?
The author proposes a carefully phased approach to documenting these massive societal harms.
What is the first phase?
The first phase, which is happening right now while the conflict is ongoing, is rigorous documentation.
Because evidence decays.
Exactly. Evidence decays quickly. Witnesses scatter across the globe as refugees. Digital footprints are erased by retreating armies. So the immediate goal is preserving the data.
And the second phase?
The second phase, which occurs later when security permits, involves public hearings to establish an authoritative historical record.
I am looking at this Truth Commission concept, and I have a serious question about the modern trend of what the text calls moral flattening.
Moral flattening. That is a dangerous trend.
It is. In a lot of modern secular truth processes around the world, there is a noticeable push toward this idea that everyone is a victim, blame is shared equally by all sides, and we just need to sit in a circle, hold hands, and reconcile.
Yeah, a forced superficial peace.
Let us use a playground analogy. Imagine a school principal dealing with a fight. A known bully walks up and viciously punches a smaller kid in the face.
Okay.
The smaller kid fights back to defend himself. If the principal decides to suspend both the bully and the kid who got punched just to keep the peace and force them to shake hands, that is not justice.
No, that is terrible leadership.
That is a total denial of reality. It tells the victim that their self-defense is morally equivalent to the bully's aggression. Does the Truth Commission model proposed in these texts fall into that trap of making everyone equally guilty?
The expert who wrote the political science text explicitly warns against that kind of theatrical reconciliation.
Oh, good.
The author states very clearly that truth-telling must humanize victims, but it must never, under any circumstances, erase the reality of aggression, command intent, or coercion.
So it maintains the clear line between aggressor and victim.
Yes. The Truth Commission is not there to enforce a false equivalence between the invading force and the defending population. It is there to document the specific systems of abuse and clarify the historical record.
That makes a lot of sense.
If the state forces victims to share equal blame with an aggressor state just to achieve a superficial sense of harmony, the concept of moral responsibility dissolves entirely. You get moral flattening.
Which helps no one.
The text insists that a successful truth process keeps post-war unity from depending on silence or lies. The society must be allowed to remember truthfully together, without propagandistic distortions telling them they imagined the crimes.
So once the truth is established, the historical record is clear, and the criminals are facing justice in the courts, the physical rebuilding of the nation begins.
The hard physical labor.
But both the political science text and the theological text make it clear that rebuilding is not just about pouring concrete, laying asphalt, and putting up drywall.
Right, there is a moral element to the construction.
The way a nation handles its reconstruction money is the ultimate test of justice itself. Let us unpack the staggering financial statistics regarding this recovery effort.
The numbers are mind-boggling.
They are. The RDNA-5 estimate, which is dated December 31st, 2025, calculates $195.1 billion in direct physical damage.
Just for physical damage.
That is just the cost of broken buildings, destroyed bridges, and bombed power plants. It also calculates $666.7 billion in socioeconomic losses. That covers the lost wages, the collapsed businesses, and the disruption of trade. Overall, the estimate outlines a need for $587.7 billion for recovery and reconstruction spread over a 10-year period.
That is over $500 billion.
This massive figure is corroborated by the World Bank's February 2026 estimate, which landed at $588 billion. To aid in this monumental task, the text mentions the EU-Ukraine facility, which entered into force on March 1, 2024, providing 50 billion euros through the year 2027.
When you have that amount of money flowing into a recovering nation, the structural philosophy of how it is spent matters immensely.
Right, it cannot just be a free-for-all.
The political science text introduces a fascinating concept to govern this process: They call it reparative citizenship.
Reparative citizenship. What does that mean in practice?
The author argues that a destroyed apartment block is not just a loss of earth and mortar, it is a civic injury.
A civic injury.
Think about what happens when a residential building falls. The people who live there lose their voting connection to their district.
Oh, that is true.
They lose their access to their local medical clinic, their children lose their school continuity, and the neighborhood loses its identity.
So their entire connection to the state is severed.
Exactly. When the government rebuilding agency steps in, rebuilding that apartment is not just a construction project. It is about restoring the citizens' equal membership in the republic.
That gives so much weight to a simple construction contract.
However, the text points out a severe obstacle to this process. It cites Razumkov polling from November 2025, which revealed a massive societal divide regarding institutional trust.
What did the polling show?
The polling showed that the public had extremely high trust in the armed forces and volunteer organizations.
Which makes sense. Those are the people who fought and sacrificed.
But there was massive distrust toward the parliament, the courts, prosecutors, and local officials.
Oh, man.
And those are the people who will be in charge of handling the reconstruction funds.
That massive distrust brings us right back to the theological text, which provides a rigorous, unyielding lens on the handling of this money.
The theological perspective on finances is fierce.
It is. The theological author shifts focus from the sword of the magistrate to the financial commands in Romans 13:6-7. Paul commands the believers to pay taxes, using the specific Greek word phoron, and revenue, using the word telos.
So he's talking about direct taxation and customs duties.
Yes, the essay argues that this apostolic command means public funds are a sacred trust before God.
A sacred trust.
The taxpayer is commanded by God to give the money, which means the magistrate receiving the money is holding it under divine scrutiny.
That changes the dynamic completely.
The theological author asserts that embezzlement, bribery, or cronyism during the Reconstruction phase is not just a white-collar administrative crime.
Right. It is not just a minor offense.
It is not just skimming off the top of a construction contract. It is direct treason against the government of God.
Treason against God. That is an incredible phrase.
When a local magistrate or a federal official steals funds meant for rebuilding a shattered community, they are abusing a divinely appointed office.
Right.
Therefore, the text argues that anti-corruption safeguards are absolute theological requirements.
Wow.
They are not just technocratic accessories demanded by international donors or the World Bank. They are a moral mandate.
To fully grasp how to handle this chaotic geopolitical situation and to understand why the Apostle Paul wrote these commands in the first place, both sources force us to zoom out and look at the broader historical and eternal timelines.
Context is everything.
The theological text dives deep into the historical context of Paul writing the letter to the Romans. He wrote it in AD 57, living under the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero.
Nero was notoriously brutal.
Very brutal. The early Christians were a highly vulnerable minority living the capital city of a brutal pagan empire. The author points out the precarious nature of their situation, referencing the Roman historian Suetonius.
What did Suetonius record?
Suetonius recorded that the previous emperor, Claudius, had expelled Jews from Rome because of constant political disturbances regarding a figure named Chrestus, which historians believe was a reference to disputes over Christ.
So the Christians were already on thin ice.
Yes. The Christian church in Rome, living under Nero, could easily have been swept up in anti-imperial zealotry. They had every human reason to hate the Roman government.
The essay explains that Paul had a very specific strategic goal in writing these commands to submit to the authorities. He wanted to prevent political insurrection.
He knew what would happen if they revolted.
He knew that if the Christians took up arms against Rome, like the Jewish war that would eventually break out in AD 66 through 70 and lead to the destruction of Jerusalem, they would be annihilated.
It would have been a slaughter.
Paul wanted Christians to be model citizens who disarmed pagan slander by paying their custom duties meticulously and living quiet, productive lives.
By doing so, they proved to the surrounding culture that they were not a seditious threat to the public order.
But the text draws a massive, strict boundary between the geopolitical state and the spiritual kingdom.
A very firm line.
Citing Christ's command in Mark 12:1 to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. The theological author clarifies that the church does not advance through political lobbying, military force, or taking over the government apparatus.
The state has its lane and the church has its lane.
Yes, exactly.
That boundary is critical to understanding the author's argument. Because of this strict separation between the temporal state and the eternal kingdom, the theological text explicitly rejects several modern ideological frameworks that try to blur the lines.
What frameworks does it reject?
It rejects the social gospel, which attempts to reduce Christianity to a program of social reform, treating the state as the primary vehicle for Christian love.
Okay, so state-mandated charity is not the gospel.
Right. It rejects critical race theory, which the author argues views justice only through the subjective lens of class and racial dynamics, rather than the objective, immutable moral law of God. It rejects Arminian humanism, which views the state as a social contract born of human utility and democratic consensus, rather than a direct, top-down divine decree.
So the state is not just a human invention.
And it rejects postmillennial reconstructionism, which attempts to establish the kingdom of God on earth through political legislation and taking dominion over civil institutions.
Basically rejecting the idea of a theocracy.
Yes. The text maintains that the geopolitical state has a temporal, punitive function, wielding the sword against evil, while the spiritual kingdom operates on an entirely different plane, dealing with the eternal salvation of the soul.
I want to synthesize the warnings from both texts here, because they mirror each other beautifully, even though they use different vocabularies.
Yeah, the parallels are striking.
The political science text warns against vindictive nationalism. This is the secular danger of treating every internal suspicion as a test of patriotism, where the state becomes obsessed with ideological purity and tears itself apart looking for traitors.
Right, the witch hunt mentality.
The theological text warns against political messianism. This is the theological delusion that a political leader, a specific policy, or a government structure can actually save the soul of a nation and bring about a utopia.
Which is idolatry, really.
I think about it like this. Trusting the state to bring ultimate spiritual salvation is like expecting a mall security guard to perform open-heart surgery.
That is a great analogy.
The state is the security guard. Its job is to maintain the perimeter, to wield the sword, to stop the active shooter, to lock the doors, and to maintain the boundary of public order.
It is a necessary God-ordained job.
But it cannot fix the human heart. It does not save the soul. It can only restrain the outward actions of the body.
The theological text concludes by acknowledging the limitations of that security guard, focusing on eschatological hope.
Looking to the future.
The author points out that the temporal magistrate wields an imperfect sword. Earthly courts make mistakes.
Judges are sometimes corrupt.
Evidence is lost. And as we saw with the four-tier system, human courts often fail to capture the major perpetrators or have to let lesser offenders go due to a lack of resources.
It is never a perfect system down here.
The justice we get on earth is always going to be a shadow of true justice. But the believer's hope is rooted in the premillennial, pre-tribulational return of Jesus Christ.
That is the ultimate horizon.
The text asserts that while human institutions struggle, fail, and constantly try to balance justice and reconstruction, Christ is the ultimate judge who will return to bring perfect, absolute, and eternal justice to the earth.
So the believer can submit to an imperfect state now because they know a perfect kingdom is coming.
Yes, precisely.
So synthesizing everything we have unpacked from this massive stack of sources, whether you are viewing this crisis through the secular lens of international transitional justice, trying to figure out how to balance courts and construction budgets,
Or through the rigorous exegesis of biblical theology, analyzing Greek verbs and the divine ordinance.
the conclusion aligns perfectly. You cannot have social cohesion and lasting peace without the strict application of lawful justice and absolute fiscal integrity.
You cannot pave over atrocities.
You cannot force victims to shake hands with their abusers.
And you cannot let corruption rot the rebuilding process without inviting disaster.
Both texts demand that a society look reality in the face.
The guilty must be named.
The victims must be heard.
The historical record must be accurate.
And the rebuilding process must restore the civic dignity of the population. Anything less is a failure of both political science and moral duty.
It really is.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative question derived from these sources, something to chew on as you look at the news and watch these massive global events unfold.
It is a sobering thought.
If the state's highest calling is to execute justice to enable a lasting peace, what happens to a society when the global community's attention shifts to the next crisis and the international funds dry up? Does the demand for justice expire when the money runs out? Or does the moral debt simply compound in the background, waiting for a final, unavoidable reckoning? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep examining the foundation of the ideas shaping our world.